My fiancée demanded a $25K wedding with a loan. I canceled everything in front of her parents. But when I saw what happened with her next rich boyfriend, karma was brutal, and she was left alone forever. I'm 31 years old. I work as a network technician, and there are still people who ask me if I regret calling off my wedding like 3 years ago. The short answer is no, not at all, but the full story is a bit more complicated than that, I guess. What happened basically taught me that no matter how much you think you know someone, people can surprise you in the worst possible ways when it comes to money and expectations. I grew up in a working-class family, the kind of home where my parents made every dollar count. My dad was an electrician, and my mom worked in an administrative office, and we never had much extra money, but we never lacked anything important either. What I did learn from a very young age was the value of money and how to manage it responsibly. My parents never bought anything on credit except the house. They paid for everything in cash. And if they couldn't afford something, they simply waited until they could. I remember when I was like 12 years old, I wanted a new bike, a really expensive BMX that all my friends had, and my dad told me, if you want it, save up to buy it. So I spent the whole summer mowing lawns and washing cars until I could buy it myself. That lesson stuck with me forever. So fast forward to when I was like 27 years old, already working several years as a network technician with a decent salary, nothing spectacular but stable. I lived in a small but comfortable apartment, drove a 2015 Honda Civic that I bought used, and had a good amount of savings because I followed the same financial rules my parents taught me. I never overspent, invested regularly, and basically lived below my means. I wasn't cheap or anything like that. I went out with friends, treated myself occasionally, but always in moderation and never buying things I couldn't pay for in cash. It was at my friend Trevor's housewarming party where I met Heather. She was 28 years old at the time, worked as a sales manager at a clothing store, and honestly, I thought she was amazing from the first moment. She was fun, intelligent, and what I liked most was that she seemed super relaxed and unpretentious. We started talking and ended up spending the whole night together at that party, and when I told her about my view on money and my financial goals, she said she thought it was super sensible and mature. She told me she was also tired of guys who lived beyond their means trying to impress people. I mean, she sounded like the perfect match for me, We started dating, and the first 2 years were genuinely good. We did simple things, went for walks, went fishing at the lake near town, cooked together at home more often than going out to expensive restaurants, and she never complained about any of that. In fact, she seemed to enjoy it. I met her parents several times, and although I noticed they lived in a bigger house than my parents and had newer cars, I didn't think much of it. Heather's family clearly had more money than mine, but she never acted like that mattered. After 2 years together, I decided I wanted to marry her. I saved for several months and bought an engagement ring with a blue sapphire stone that I had custom made because I knew blue was her favorite color. It cost me like $2,000, which for me was a significant amount but not something that would put me in financial trouble. I took her to the same lake where we had gone fishing on our first real date and proposed there. She said yes, cried, hugged me, and told me the ring was perfect and exactly what she would have chosen. But that's where the first signs that something wasn't right started, although at the time I didn't recognize them as such. When we went to tell her parents that same night, I saw her mom look at the ring, and there was like a second of awkward silence before she said, "Oh, how nice. It's different." And Heather, instead of defending the ring or saying how much she loved it like she had told me, just laughed nervously and said something like, "Yeah, well, Brian is very practical about these things." At that moment, I thought maybe I was being paranoid, but looking back, I should have paid more attention. Things got really weird when we started planning the wedding. At first, I had suggested something small and intimate, like 50 people maximum, at the community center in town or maybe in my parents' backyard if the weather allowed it. I had calculated that we could have a nice and memorable wedding for something between $5,000 and $7,000 if we were smart with the budget. Heather at that time said that sounded fine and that we didn't need anything extravagant. But then, I don't know exactly when it happened, like a switch got activated in her. Suddenly, the guest list started growing. First, it was some cousins she hadn't seen in years, then coworkers she barely knew, then friends of her parents. In a couple of weeks, we went from 50 people to 100, and then to 150, when I tried to talk to her about this, she said. Oh, Brian, don't be ridiculous. We can't not invite these people. We'll look super cheap. And then came the venue issue. The community center was no longer an option, according to her. Now we needed a proper venue. And she took me to see like 3 different places, and the cheapest one cost $15,000 just for the space, not including food or anything else. I told her that was completely out of our budget, and she looked at me like I had said something offensive. She told me, "It's our wedding, Brian. We're only going to get married once. We can't do it just anywhere." Things kept escalating. Now we needed plated dinner service instead of a buffet, because according to Heather, buffets are too informal for a real wedding. We needed a live band instead of a DJ, because music is what people remember. We needed a professional wedding coordinator because it was too stressful to try to organize everything ourselves. Every time I questioned something or tried to suggest a more economical alternative, she got defensive and accused me of not wanting our wedding to be special. One day I came home from work and found her on her laptop watching YouTube videos about how to improve or upgrade your engagement ring. When I asked her what she was doing, she closed the laptop super fast and told me she was just browsing. But I saw enough to know exactly what she was looking for. That hurt more than I expected, honestly. Not because the ring was the most expensive thing in the world, but because she had told me she loved it and that it was perfect, and it turns out all that time she was thinking about how to change it. Things with the bridesmaids also got out of control. Heather chose these Vera Wang dresses that cost like $500 each, and when her best friend Morgan told her that was a lot of money, Heather told her that if she really loved her, she would be willing to make that sacrifice. And then she was planning a bachelorette trip to Miami for a whole weekend, expecting each girl to pay their share, which added up to like $1,200 between flight, hotel, and activities. 2 of her friends told her they couldn't afford that, and Heather literally told them that. Then maybe they shouldn't be part of the bridesmaid group. I tried to talk to her about all this rationally. I showed her numbers, explained how much money we had available, proposed a total budget of $10,000, which was already much more than I had originally planned. But every time I brought up the topic, we ended up fighting. She told me I didn't understand how important this day was to her, that all her friends had had nice weddings and she wasn't going to be less, that her parents would be embarrassed if we did something too simple. And that's when we reached the breaking point. We were sitting on the couch in my apartment on a Sunday afternoon, surrounded by wedding magazines and budgets, and Heather told me, very casual, very calm, "What if we take out a loan for the wedding? We can borrow like $25,000 and pay it back in 3 years. The payments aren't even that high. It would be like $700 a month." I just stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. I said, "Are you serious? You want us to start our marriage with $25,000 in debt for a one-day party?" And she answered, "It's not just a party, Brian. It's our wedding. It's the most important day of our lives." I responded that no, that the marriage is what's important, not the wedding. And that there was no way I was going to start our life together, owing that amount of money for something completely unnecessary. She got angry, told me I was being unreasonable and stingy, that I clearly didn't care enough to give her the wedding of her dreams. I tried to explain again that it wasn't a matter of not caring, but of being financially responsible, but she didn't want to listen. The argument ended with her going to sleep at her parents' house that night. But what happened next was even worse. Heather started involving my family in this. She called my sister Rachel, who at the time was like 26 years old, and told her version of the story, saying I was being selfish and refusing to make any sacrifice for our wedding. Rachel, who has always been more emotional than practical with money, called me and told me maybe I should reconsider, that it was true that a wedding was important and that Heather just wanted a nice day. I tried to explain the numbers to her, but she cut me off and told me I was being very closed-minded. And then Heather and her parents invited me to dinner at their house. I thought maybe they wanted to have a calm conversation about all this, find some middle ground or something. How naive I was. It was basically an ambush. Heather's parents, especially her dad who worked as an executive at some company in the city, started telling me I was being unreasonable, that they had saved some money to contribute to the wedding, but it wasn't enough to cover everything Heather wanted, and that as the groom, it was my responsibility to make sure she had the wedding she deserved. Her mom told me, "What are people going to think if we have a cheap wedding? They're going to think you can't provide for our daughter." And her dad added something like, "When I married Heather's mom, I made sure to give her everything she wanted, even if that meant making some sacrifices." They said the word sacrifices like 5 times during that dinner. Heather was sitting there letting her parents attack me, nodding at everything they said. It was at that moment that something clicked in my head. I realized this wasn't just about the wedding. It was about fundamentally different values. Heather and her family saw money and status in a way that was incompatible with how I had been raised and what I believed. For them, it was normal, and expected to go into debt to impress other people, and I just couldn't live like that. I stood up from the table, looked at Heather, and told her, "I think we made a mistake. We can't get married if we have such different views on something as important as money." I gave her back the ring right there in front of her parents. Her dad got furious, started yelling at me that I was a coward and that I was embarrassing his daughter, but I was already walking toward the door. Heather ran after me crying, saying we could work it out, that we could find a solution, but I already knew there was no possible solution. The following days were horrible. Heather told everyone her version of what happened, painting me as a cheap and selfish boyfriend who canceled the wedding because he didn't want to spend money on her. Many of our mutual friends took her side, including Trevor, who had been my friend for years. My sister, Rachel, was also mad at me for a while, telling me I should have tried harder, that maybe I was too harsh or too inflexible. But my parents supported me completely. My dad told me, "Son, you did the right thing. Never start a marriage with debt unless it's absolutely necessary. And a party is never absolutely necessary." My mom added that if Heather really loved me, she would have been willing to work with me to find a solution that worked for both of us, not just for her. What happened next was almost comical, in a way. Like 3 months after ending our engagement, Morgan, Heather's best friend who had been one of the bridesmaids, sent me a message. She told me Heather had started dating a guy named Robert, a lawyer who made much more money than me, drove a Mercedes, lived in a penthouse in the city. At first I thought, well, good for her. Maybe she found someone who can give her the lifestyle she wants. But it turns out Heather didn't change her behavior at all. According to Morgan, after only 4 months dating Robert, Heather was already pressuring him to get engaged and start planning a wedding. Robert, who apparently wasn't a fool either, told her it was too soon. But Heather insisted, and eventually he gave in and bought her a ring, one much more expensive than mine according to what I found out later. And guess what happened? Exactly the same thing. Heather started planning an extravagant wedding, even more expensive than the one she had wanted with me because now she knew Robert had more money. Super luxurious venue, designer dress, honeymoon in Europe, the whole package. The thing is, Robert, although he made good money, wasn't a millionaire either, and when he saw how much Heather was spending and how much she expected him to pay, he basically did the same thing I did. He told her she was being unreasonable, that he wasn't going to spend $50,000 on a wedding, and when she insisted and started pressuring him just like she had done with me, he ended the relationship. Morgan told me all this like 6 months after my breakup with Heather. She told me she wanted me to know that I hadn't been the problem, that Heather had a real issue with expectations and materialism. She also told me she felt bad for not supporting me more. When all our stuff happened, that now she understood why I had made the decision I made. It's been like 3 years since all that. Heather, as far as I know, is still single. According to Morgan, she's dated several guys, but it always ends up being the same story. She starts making unrealistic demands and they walk away. Apparently, she's still living with her parents, which is ironic considering how much she worried about what people would think. As for me, I bought a small cabin near the lake like a year ago, a place I had always wanted to have. I bought it in cash using the savings I had accumulated, partly because I continued being disciplined with my money and partly because I didn't have to spend $25,000 on a wedding. I still work at the same job, still drive the same Honda Civic, although I'm already considering changing it. But only when I can pay for a new one without financing. And honestly, I'm in a really good place financially and emotionally. My sister Rachel eventually apologized to me. She told me that after seeing what happened with Robert, she realized I had been right all along. She says she learned a lesson about not judging situations you don't fully understand. Do I regret ending the engagement? Not at all. Sometimes people tell me I was too extreme, that I should have tried harder to find a middle ground. but I know deep down there was no possible middle ground with someone who was willing to start a life together with massive debt just to impress people who probably didn't even really care. Marriage is about a lot of things, but financial compatibility is more important than people think. If you can't agree on something as basic as how much to spend on a wedding, how are you going to agree on buying a house, having kids, saving for retirement, and all the other important financial decisions that come with a life together? Last week, I was at my cabin, sitting on the dock looking at the lake, the same lake where I proposed to Heather 4 years ago now, and I realized I didn't feel a trace of regret or sadness. I only felt peace and gratitude for having had the courage to stand firm in my values, even though at the time it seemed like everyone was against me. I guess that's the moral of this whole story, if there is one, that sometimes doing the right thing means doing the difficult thing, and that it's better to be alone and true to your principles than to be with someone who wants you to be someone you're not.